This broadcast of Cosmos FM is paid for by the Greek American Educational Public Information Systems. We'd like to remind you the opinions expressed on this program do not reflect those of the Cosmos FM staff, producers, volunteers, or the GAEPI's Board of Directors.
Your journey into the heart and soul of Greece. And now, member-supported Hellenic Public Radio Cosmos FM 91.5, a bilingual Greek-American radio program coming to you every day through WNYE 91.5 FM from the Demetrius and Georgia Kaloidis Broadcasting Studios to the greater New York area and worldwide through cosmosfm.org. Our programs air Monday through Friday from 7 to 8 p.m., Saturdays from noon to 3:30 p.m., and Sunday mornings from 9 to 1:30 p.m.
We often hear that the ancient Greek world is nothing more than a distant memory of the past, and that the passage of time has erased much of its significance. Perhaps what we hear is wrong. Perhaps in our quest to define ourselves, we too quickly turn away and follow other opinions. Well, tonight we will put that ancient Greek world front and center and return to those steady ocean tides that will take our mind to distant lands and peoples, with my special guest as helmsman on the voyage. All of that is next on Musical Masterworks.
Musical Masterworks, a program dedicated to the rediscovery of great symphonic, instrumental, choral, operatic, cinematic, and electronic compositions from antiquity to the present, with your host, Mike Stratis.
And good evening. Welcome to Musical Masterworks with your host, Mike Stratis. Tonight is a very special night. In fact, right off the top, I want to thank Anna Eliopoulos for switching with me to have this opportunity to have my recurring guest with me for a topic that is quite fascinating, a topic that is mind-boggling. I'm just glad that I have the right person here to talk about this with me. And just right up from the top, people think there is no connection between the ancient Greeks and today's Greeks, that we are simply an Indo-European tribe like other Europeans, and that the ancient Greek world has no connection with the modern Greek world. But my guest today will prove otherwise. I speak of Esmeralda Mourikis, and welcome again to the show.
Good evening, Mike. Thank you very much for inviting me. Well, you're right. The great orator Stratis, around 2,400 years ago, wrote in his work Panegyrikos, "The land where we were born belongs to us with no interruption. We are the natives." And there is also no evidence of interruption of the Greek language for at least 12,000 years. If the language had not been the same, the Greeks would not have been able to pass information about big geodynamic and atmospheric phenomena to the next generation, like, for instance, the flood of Samothraki, which, according to the historian Theodoros Sikeliotis, is the most ancient. And even today, we're using Homeric words, not only similar.
Before you get to that, Esmeralda, I want to cut you off right there because I don't want you to lose that train of thought. I request humbly that you address those geodynamic events later on in the discussion, if you may.
We will. Absolutely.
Great.
So even today, we are using Homeric words, not only similar, but also identical. For example, the word astragalos,
right,
which is the ankle. In Homeric times, it meant the vertebra. Episkopos, inspector, today's meaning the bishop. Ivris, disrespect. Othoni, the screen. In Homer's time was the linen cloth. Right? You remember, Othoni is a Homeric word.
Absolutely.
And I think one more is identical, comes to my mind right now, Pharos. Pharos, the lighthouse, which meant the cover, right?
Right.
So Sir Arthur Evans proved once and for all that the Cretan script does not come from anywhere else. And he wrote in 1894, Cretan cryptographs and pre-Phoenician script. He knocked down the 19th century Indo-European theory. Crete is the cradle of the Greek writing, of the Greek script. And the Phoenicians do not have a pre-existing script. And in Europe, who was writing in Europe? Only the Etruscans. And they were using the alphabet from Halkida.
Esmeralda, I just want to verify what you're saying, and I think I might have brought this up to you in the past about the ancient historian Strabo, who wrote that no people from India, which I guess is some descriptor for the lands of the Indo-Europeans, is probably what he's implying, migrated westwards. Thus, the implication is that the Minoan civilization, which is the cradle of Greek civilization, is indigenous. And didn't Sir Arthur Evans also use this Strabo information to knock down the 19th century theories about an Indo-European origin for the Greeks?
You're absolutely right. Strabo wrote that. There is no migration of the people in India to the West.
Fascinating. It's truly fascinating.
And we should not forget that the alphabet, the Greek alphabet, was invented by the Trojan War hero Palamidis, Evripidis, Aristotelis, Philostratos. They all write that Palamidis is the one who invented the letters and put the syllables together. What the historian Diodorus Sikeliotis writes is that the Phoenicians changed the shape, the form of the letters, and since the majority of the people used that kind of writing, it was called Phoenician.
That's fascinating. It really is. Because usually it's the reversal. We usually hear the reverse, but this is something going the other direction.
Exactly.
So let me just, for the sake of the audience, clarify. When Esmeralda is mentioning Diodorus Sikeliotis, we're talking about Diodorus Siculus or Diodorus of Sicily. Okay. So Esmeralda, you mentioned to me that the Greeks passed traditions and stories about climate and geodynamic events to the succeeding generations. Please explain that to me.
Well, Plato writes that, Aristoteles also. We don't only have periodic repetition, but also like a cycle of the phenomena. Since the cosmic period is defined by a set number of years, which are called heavenly streams, because, Mike, whatever is born deteriorates and obeys to cosmic periods and the recycling of universal life. And we all know that the ancient cultures connected these phenomena, whether they were geodynamic or atmospheric, they always connected them with the gods, with a divine volition. And the first one who disconnected natural catastrophes from the divine volition was Thales.
Thales of Miletus, right? Esmeralda, Thales of Miletus, the pre-Socratic thinker, was also the founder of natural philosophy. Yes.
Absolutely. And that happened around 2,600 years ago. Long time ago. And still today we find people who believe when an earthquake happens or flooding happens that God created it. God did it.
Are there any elements here that could connect with also climate changing? I mean, that's the natural catastrophes are clearly seen as some kind of a connection between beliefs in the religious entities as well as how people view them. But in terms of how the follow-up, the consequences, any kind of climate circumstance, are there any beliefs about that?
We do have Professor Ali, for instance. He states that the climate was definitely warmer between 3,150 and 3,350 years ago. And this was called the warm Minoan period. And also, according to two professors in the early 80s, Professor Worsley and Professor Herman, and Professor Barry in 1989, there is indication that the Arctic was episodic ice-free.
Wow.
And in 2009, Professors Bentley and Hudson stated that around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, Antarctica was ice-free. And the biggest evidence to verify this statement that Antarctica had indeed been ice-free is the Piri Reis map, which was drawn in 1513. But according to Piri Reis himself, this map was based on ancient maps.
Esmeralda, for the sake of the audience, if I may clarify, Piri Reis was the famous Ottoman admiral who was known for his creation of a map sometime, as you said, in 1513, you said?
1513, yes.
15, and this was discovered in 1929 in the Topkapi Museum, right, in Constantinople at the time?
That is correct. Yes,
okay.
yes. Mm-hmm. And something very interesting is in 1960, Professor Charles Hapgood sent a letter to the Geographic Society that Antarctica had been ice-free, so people were not only able to sail there, but also able to draw maps. And these people must have been Minoans, Mycenaeans, or Phoenicians. And up to today, a lot of professors disagree, stating that the Piri Reis map is not showing Antarctica, that Antarctica was always covered with ice, and that it is impossible for the Minoans or the Mycenaeans to have sailed there.
And what about the Phoenicians? And what about the Phoenicians?
They don't mention them.
Oh.
Which is weird.
Just the Greeks.
And yes. And by the way, in the answer to Professor Hapgood's letter, which came from the commander of the United States Air Force, Harold Ohlmeyer, in July 6, 1960, we can read the geographical details shown in the lower part of the map agrees with the seismic profile made across the top of the ice cap by Swedish-British expedition of 1949. This indicates the coastline had been mapped before it was covered by the ice cap. The ice cap in this region is now about a mile thick. And then at the end of the letter, we can read, but we have no idea how the data on this map can be reconciled with the supposed state of geographic knowledge in 1513.
So just to sum up, Professor Hapgood, by presenting this argument, got some agreement, but not necessarily in the whole picture. Exactly. And that his argument was clearly based on a map, the Piri Reis map, that was by many accounts based on ancient maps. Exactly. And by the way, from my personal knowledge, I think he also studied a map of a famous French cartographer, Orontius Phineas, who was also thrown in that. So
you're absolutely right.
So tell me about this map making situation and these maps that existed before.
The first one who draws a map showing Antarctica is Stratis Malotis, and that happened 2,250 years ago. By the way, he's the founder of the Library of Pergamos. And if we see that map, it shows a globe. On the left side, we can clearly see North and South America. And on the east side, we can clearly see Europe, Africa, and Antarctica. And I think we should not forget that Kratis Malotis is the one that also stated that the river existing in the ocean flows from the tropic, from the winter tropic, towards the South Pole. And he's not the first one who made this statement. The Orphic said that, Homer said that, Hesiod, Kratis, Plutarch, Proclus. They all mention the existing river in the ocean. But it's globally accepted that the first person who mentions a stream in the ocean is Ponce de Leon in 1513. Why?
Wow. I remember that you and I had a conversation on Plutarch and his views on these things several years ago. Can you please elaborate on some of the arguments he made relating to this?
Well, Plutarch mentions in his work concerning the face which appears in the orb of the moon in Moralia, περί του εμφαινομένου προσώπου του κύκλου της Σελήνης. Is that correct?
Yes.
I think this is the Greek title, yeah.
Yeah.
He mentions Ogygia, an island which is 5 days westwards from England, from Britain. There is no other island than Iceland. And if you stop for supplies, you reach the Faroe Islands. And by the way, the most western island of the Faroe Islands is called Mykonos.
So you're saying that between Iceland and Britain are the Faroe Islands, and one of them is named Mykonos. I mean, that is quite amazing.
The most
Mykonos,
western island.
the
yes.
most western of that island chain. Wow. Please continue.
And Plutarch mentions 3 other islands, which are located towards the area where the sun sets in the summer, towards the west. And then he speaks about the big continent by which the big sea is encircled. If we look at the map, he's talking about Greenland, Baffin Island, Newfoundland, and North America.
Wow.
Furthermore, he writes about the Greeks residing around the bay, which entrance is located in the same parallel with the entrance of the Caspian Sea. This is St. Lawrence Bay.
Wow.
And he also mentions the area, and I think he's the only ancient writer who states that there is an area where the sun sets 1 hour for 30 days. And this was the area where the new people arriving with their missions would stay for 90 days. This area is the southern part of Greenland and also the most southern edge of Baffin Island.
Wow.
And he also speaks about Kronos and his people residing there, and then Iraklis and his people arriving later. So the Greek element that had been vanishing rose to life again with Iraklis.
And definitely the correlation between those names and the people there must be indicating some Greek element. Absolutely.
Yes. And all these missions went there for mining and trading activities, because around Lake Superior, copper is 99% pure. Copper was also found in North Wisconsin and in Minnesota. And around Lake Superior and in Royal Island, a huge amount of mines were found. And American mining experts say that in the prehistoric times, at least 500,000 tons of pure copper were mined. And most of it was exported because it was not found here. We have copper objects from Florida to Quebec, but not to that extent. We're talking about 500,000 tons of pure copper here.
Wow, that's a lot.
A lot. And many mines were also connected underground.
Wow.
And with the help of the radioactive anthrax 14, the scientists were able to tell us when these mines started operating. And this happened I'm sorry?
Yes. I was going to ask you, have they excavated in these locations?
Yes, and with the help of the anthrax 14, radioactive anthrax 14, they were able to state when they started operating, 4,493 years ago.
That's 2,400 BC or thereabouts, right?
Wow.
Thereabouts.
Yeah. And
Wow.
it stopped 3,070 years ago with the decline of the Mycenaeans. And by the way, these activities of the Minoans and the Mycenaeans must have been secret, otherwise they would have been continued by the Phoenicians or later by the Egyptians. Something very interesting also is that the natives of northern Wisconsin referred to light-skinned men working in the mines. And this was verified about 100 years ago by Barrett. And he stated that the miners were indeed Europeans from the tools they were using.
Wow, that's quite amazing.
And we have also proof that a lot of this copper was exported to Mexico, to the Olmecs.
Yes, that makes sense. That's the time.
Mm-hmm. I find fascinating the fact that in the Museum of Milwaukee in Wisconsin, in the old copper collection, we can see the double axe. This axe was found about 100 years ago. They call it banner stone, and they say that it was made by the natives, and they don't know the meaning of it. But nobody mentions that the same axe was found by Evans in Knossos, which is a symbol, a sacred symbol. It's the symbol of the heavenly substance of Mother Goddess. But nobody mentions this in the museum in Wisconsin.
Esmeralda, would that be the famous labrys that we see that was on the side of the walls that was exhibited above to call the building the labyrinth because it was the labrys, that symbol that was on there, the double axe?
The double axe, yes.
Yes. Okay.
And same goes with the Newberry tablet, which was discovered in the town Newberry in northwestern Michigan. It was discovered more than 100 years ago, and the Smithsonian is not aware of its origin. But the same sign is to be found in the museum in Cyprus. And this is an ancient Cypriot Minoan script.
Wow, that is stunning. Mm-hmm. That is stunning.
Yeah. And another indication that people were sailing the oceans, and I'm talking about the Minoans and the Mycenaeans at that time, is the fact that there were traces of nicotine and cocaine found on mummies. And I think, Mike, we should not forget the labyrinths. We find labyrinths among the Hopi Indians in Arizona, and labyrinths in Knossos. And there is a tremendous similarity there.
Yeah. Wow, that is quite stunning. We mentioned Plutarch and his views. Maybe if we take a look at the concept of the continent of America, any kind of definitive view that identifies that discovery at an earlier time?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The Flemish geographer Ortelius on the 16th century agrees with Plutarch about the big continent being America. So does the astronomer Johannes Kepler, who was a true Pythagorean, by the way. And it is said that Galileo does not refer to him, only Isaac Newton. By the way, Johannes Kepler, in his work Opera Omnia, he expresses, like Plutarch, his point of view about the role of the moon on the life cycle of the souls, which is fascinating.
It is fascinating, yes.
But Mike, I have a big question. I have really a big question. On the 10th convention in Delphi, when was it? May 2014, right?
Yes.
Professor Elias Mariolakos, the great Elias Mariolakos, he presented all these incredible geographic elements of Plutarch. And although he had extremely positive remarks, they refused to include his presentation in the records of the convention.
That's
Why?
Something.
It seems to me as if the members of the International Plutarch Society doubt Plutarch.
Yeah, that the bias by implication. By the way, for those of you listening, we did have Professor Mariolakos on Musical Masterwork several years back when we talked about a fascinating topic, which is being echoed here tonight in some of the things we're saying. And it's good to hear him, and I hope he's doing well.
He's doing well. And by the way, his second book, Greek Mythology, is in print right now. And his third book also came out.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest people get a copy of it.
Incredible,
if they can. I don't know about here, but definitely in Greece, yes.
Yeah.
So let's go from there. So the Greek presence. In fact, one of the things we mentioned in the past on that prior program was about a Greek presence in the northern parts of Europe. And I think you might want to touch on that.
Of course, Scandinavia. Two professors about 10 years ago, Murner and Lind, stated that the first visitors were Greeks.
Right.
And much later Phoenicians. And we also know the relation of the Greeks to the Hyperboreans. We have tombs of Hyperborean priestesses in Vilos. And we know about the amber in the Baltic, and we found amber in the tombs in Mykines. And about the land of the Hyperboreans, it must have been north and west of the Valdai Hills and the mountains of Belarus.
That's a big question, right? I mean, Hyperborea, it needs to be defined. I'm glad you're doing that. Mm-hmm. So north and west of the Valdai Hills, and
yes, and the mountains of Belarus, and would also have been more to the south and include also the hills south of Moscow.
Right.
And we should not also forget the expedition of Dionysus, Panas, Heracles, and Alexandros to the east.
A well-known tradition, that is, yes.
Of course, and the great historian Theodoros Sikeliotis mentions that the educated people in India know that Dionysus came from the west.
Right.
And Heracles built a lot of cities there, and the most important is Patna, ancient name Palimbothra.
Yes.
And the people in India were the Ethiopes. Hesiodos tells us that Ethiopes reside in India. The Ethiopes in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, we find them way later there. And the word Ethiops comes from the verb etho, which means burn, shine. That means suntanned.
Oh, wow.
And Homer also writes that the Ethiopians reside east and west.
Wow.
And as for the Kalas, they think that they are descendants of the soldiers of Alexander the Great, but they are even more ancient. They are descendants of the Greeks who followed Dionysus.
That's amazing. And Alexander the Great, if I'm not mistaken, as he's advancing east, he's making these connections very openly, and he's saying to people, this place is Dionysus, this is where Prometheus was, this is where Hercules was, this is where Pan was. For him to say that and to not be taken seriously, the laughter of his troops would have been very obvious, but we have no record of any obvious mockery or laughing at Alexander as a result.
Actually, Arianos writes that the people in Nyssa are descendants of the Greeks who followed Dionysus. And when they went there, they found people in Nyssa speaking Greek.
Yes.
And I think we should also not forget to mention the findings of the archaeologist Victor Ivanovich Sariyanidis in the desert Karakum in Turkmenistan. Among other 7 temples and a palace dated 4,500 years ago. And the entrance of this palace resembles that of the palace in Knossos.
And there it is again. It seems to have been a very popular model, even for distant Hopi and Turkmenistan.
That is, and we should also not forget Sri Lanka. The ancient name was Taprovani. The first ancient Greek who mentions Taprovani, Sri Lanka, is Alexander's captain Onisikratos or Astipaleos.
Yes. Right.
And Professor Pires writes that the Greeks of Alexander were the first Europeans who went to Sri Lanka, and he wonders whether his earliest ancestors would even have been enriched by the admixture of a streak of Greek blood.
Wow. And we also know that Alexander's Admiral Nearchus was known for a very famous expedition from along the Indian Ocean. We don't know the exact limits, which could include as far south as Sri Lanka, but he's definitely on the Indian Ocean, making his way back to the Persian Gulf.
Of course he was.
This is quite fascinating stuff, and I think we're going to need some time to ruminate as to the details that we've heard, and it is quite fascinating. I would like to say that this time we will be cutting for the news from Greece, and please stay close to your radio and your computer screen and your Alexa. We'll be back with more after the news from Greece. And welcome back to Musical Masterworks with a special edition tonight with my recurring guest, Esmeralda Mourikis, who's really presenting a fascinating array of thoughts and arguments and established views about the, I guess we'd call it the prehistoric world and the ancient world, going far back. And one question I like to start off with Esmeralda is, as many would ask of me, show me the money. Show me the evidence for the Greeks sailing on the Atlantic.
I guess you're asking me about Odysseus and Homer's Odyssey, right?
I guess so.
Well, before we do so, let's also remember the lighthouse Heracles had built in the northwestern edge of Spain, in La Coruña. Why would Heracles build a lighthouse in the northwestern edge of Spain if people were not sailing in the Atlantic?
The Pillars of Hercules, correct? That area?
Correct, yes. So, speaking of Odysseus, the Trojan War, as we know, which was a civil war, lasted for about 10 years. After the war, there were enormous financial issues, and Odysseus sailed. Where did he sail? They still insist that he sailed and he got lost in the Mediterranean. He cannot be lost in the Mediterranean. Why? Because all the Greeks of his time were very much aware of the area, plus the heroes of the Trojan War were descendants of the Argonauts. And the most important factor is the description of the streams of the ocean, which does not apply to the closed Mediterranean Sea. Homer clearly describes the river ocean, which surrounds the earth, coils around the earth, and calls it Apsoro, Vathidini, Vathiro, and Opistoro. Apsoros has a rounded flow that produces whirlpools. Vathidinis means it produces whirlpools deep inside the water. Vathiros means flows deep, and Opistoros means flows backwards. So Homer clearly describes the Gulf Stream, and the airspace technology shows clearly the flow and gives credit not only to Homer, but to the Orphics, to Hesiod, to Plutarch, to Proclus. And we should also remember the very well-known map by Benjamin Franklin, drawn in 1785, if I'm correct. And it clearly shows the Gulf Stream like a river.
Wow, Franklin did that. Wow, that's interesting. Very interesting.
And in Odyssey, again, we can read in Rhapsody Lambda, verse 21, following the ocean's stream. Or we can read in Rhapsody Me, first verse, when the boat left the ocean's stream. There are no streams inside the Mediterranean. And almost 3,000 years after Homer, Matthew Morey, who was a lieutenant commander of the U.S. Navy, said, there is a river in the ocean. And we need to say here that 6,000 years ago, there were no streams there before because of the icebergs. And also Homer acknowledges the existence of the easternmost limit of the other ocean, where he writes about the sunrise.
Right.
And Aristoteles writes that the sea after today's Gibraltar, Irakli Stylias, expands to India. And this is why Columbus was searching for India.
Right. That
And
makes
by the
sense.
way, he was not aware of the stream. He was accidentally informed by fishermen.
Well, he ended up being pulled by the jet stream, right?
By
accident, yeah.
And if we see the if we go on Wikipedia and we see the map with the airspace technology of today, we see that this stream flows in the Atlantic, south of Africa, Indian Ocean, and then Pacific. The waters, like, they surround the earth and they move constantly. And this is why Hesiod called him the perfect river.
Wow.
Called the ocean the perfect river. And we should also not forget Professor Enrico Matievich. He's a professor in Rio de Janeiro and in Lima. He says that Odysseus not only sailed in the Atlantic, but he went as far as the delta of the Amazon. Actually, he identifies the Amazon with Acheron, the river of the underworld. And he points to a connection between South America and the prehistoric Greeks from findings in the north of Lima. We have Gorgones there. And we have to remember what Hesiodus in his Theogony writes, that the Gorgones are residing across from the well-known, from the famous ocean. So do the Hesperides, so does Medusa. So he probably must have read Hesiodus' Theogony.
When you say that he found Gorgons, you're implying statues of the Gorgons, correct?
Statues, of course, yes.
Right,
yes.
right. Let's be clear about that. Yeah.
All
right. Well, I have to tell you, all this that you're saying takes me back many, many, many years ago. Not that many, but enough years to say when I was a teenager, when I heard the name Henrietta Mertz, and a name which has been followed by a lot of controversy. She put out a book at the time, and she had claimed that Odysseus had sailed into the Atlantic. And if anyone is interested in that book, the book is called The Wine Dark Sea by Henrietta Mertz. Continue.
It was translated to Greek under the title Inops Pondos. Fascinating book.
Yes.
And actually, Henrietta Mertz speaks of Ogygia and identifies Ogygia with the Azore Islands. And this is why we cannot be sure if Plutarch's Ogygia and Homer's Ogygia are the same island. Nobody can say for sure.
Right, right. So there is clearly a distinction there. One says Iceland, the other one, yeah.
No. Iceland is for sure. But there might be another one with the same name. We have cities in the same under the same name.
Right.
We have Olympia, and we have Olympia here. We have Mount Olympus here, in America and in Greece. Salamina in two different areas.
In Cyprus and off the coast of Athens. Yeah,
of course. Yeah. Athens here, Athens in Greece. So nobody can say for sure if he sailed. I mean, my personal opinion is that he did not reach the northern part of Atlantic Ocean. Right. He stayed more up to Mexico or so.
Right.
Well, Greek professors were able to pinpoint the exact date of the return of Odysseus. And this team is Professor Papamarinopoulos and Preka Papadima. They found the exact date of Odysseus' return. That was October 25th, 1207. They were able to find that by Homer's description of the constellation, eclipses, etc. The solar eclipses are predictable because they follow a cycle of 18 years, the Saros cycle. So the total solar eclipse took place 5 days later, on October the 30th of 1000.
And I have to say,
around
Esmeralda,
4 o'clock in the afternoon.
Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I have to say, Esmeralda, I did a little research on this, and I found that NASA was involved. NASA was definitely involved with this, in conjunction with NASA. So this is not some claim. This is specific. In fact, Mrs. Breca Papadema, specifically using a line from Homer that you just implied, and the sun was gone from the sky and a heavy darkness spread everywhere, clearly indicating what NASA concluded with the team, that it was a 75% solar eclipse covering the Ionian Sea. And then the murder of the suitors happened, according to Breca Papadema. It's fascinating.
Oh, thank you. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And see, Homer is right again by writing that Odysseus returned home in the fall.
Right.
He mentions the fall. So he was right.
That's something. Homer is still an authority.
I think we should, people think of Odysseus like a little fascinating tale and about Penelope waiting for her husband to come back and this and that. It's more deep than that.
Yes.
First of all, we learn about the ocean, the constellations, the eclipses, the seasons, music, dancing, the hygiene at the time of Homer. They were using the water. The water was something highly important to them to clean the body, but also to wash their hands before they sat at the dinner table or lunch table.
Right.
Also about poisonous drugs they were using on the tip of the arrows. Also, they were using the opium.
Right.
Nepenthes. You remember the Nepenthes?
Nepenthe, right.
So, and something else I found, they were using sulfur dioxide to disinfect objects. And not only objects, spaces as well.
Yes.
But Mike, I think that the most important lesson we have in Odysseus, we learn from Odysseus, is the first and most significant lesson about democracy.
Yes.
On the first Rhapsody, verse between 25-35, Zeus calls all the gods to a meeting to discuss and decide altogether about Odysseus' fate.
Interesting.
This is a big democracy, the biggest lesson and the first lesson.
Well, I could rib you a little bit. I could rib you a little bit and say, sounds more like a constitutional monarchy, but but I think I mean, because there is a king of the gods, but there is a democracy clearly there. He is consulting them. In fact, as you know, throughout the works,
he didn't do what he wanted to.
Yeah. And then it's also depending on who is persuading him, if it's Hera or if it's Thetis in the Iliad, or even in the Aeneid, if it's Venus. I mean, there's always a very interesting little persuasion being used. So that's a very good point you're making.
Mm-hmm.
So there we have it, a very fascinating topic for discussion at your dinner table tonight, ladies and gentlemen. This has been quite an impressive exhibition of ideas and views and arguments and established beliefs, which truly are worth the time to take a look at. And yes, take a look at some of the names of the that have been quoted here tonight. There's a lot of stuff to consider. Very fascinating. I do at this point want to give my guest a last few seconds to say something, if she would like to close. A message?
Mike, no, I think we covered everything. It's just that I wanted to thank you very, very much. It has been a great pleasure for me to be here tonight and an honor as well. And thank you. Thank you very, very much.
It's always a pleasure having you, and especially sailing the wine dark seas and the great oceans around the world. It has been a heck of a voyage tonight. So I want to thank everybody for listening. This has been your host, Mike Stratis of Musical Masterworks. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to call at 718-204-8900. I'll be back in 2 weeks. Until that time, have a wonderful night.